You are listening to Seeking the Hidden Thing with Kryptos. Greetings, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Seeking the Hidden Thing podcast. It's my pleasure to have back friend of the show, Ben Fleming. Welcome, Ben.
Yeah, pleasure to be here.
Yeah, Ben and I were planning to discuss a short work, Russian author Fyodor Dostoevsky. Choose to spell his name however you so please. I think I found 4 different spellings of his name, and so I picked one for the title, and it'll have to stick. But it's this book, Notes from Underground. It's been a long while since I read it, and you were driven to read it from your whole 40 plus hour art series, came across this work again and said, hey, we should discuss this. And as I reread it, it's your thesis that, society is stuck on, in a place somewhere between the middle of the 1800s and the early 20th century, I think is fundamentally correct. Because when you read Dostoevsky, it's a story that I found could probably have easily been written by, say, somebody like Jacques Ellul, because all of the same themes are there in his critiques of the world that he's observing around him. And he's doing so kind of in narrative and story form in his observations. The book is broken up into 2 sections. There's a kind of a personal reflection on the Crystal Palace and its meaning, which then sets up a second section of a kind of narrative of the main character who's never named and his relationship with they're not really friends, but some acquaintances that he has, and the struggle between his own sense of self and who he is and these other fellows. And in and through that, Dostoevsky's looking at the dynamic of the world being generated and populated by the world of the Crystal Palace, and who is supposed to be running the world and who is actually running the world. And, anyways, it's, we'll get into it. You've got some notes, Ben. Why don't I hand it over to you and let you sort of begin where you want to begin, and we'll go from there.
Sure. I think you hit the nail on the head there when you said it seems to almost feel like a 20th century work of literature, not the 19th century work of literature. Specifically, it seems like the modern literature of the 1920s. Talking about how I'm doing this overarching, art history story, trying to retell the narrative of art history, which I think is all nonsense in the first place. Most of the work I've done is looked at the 1920s and 1930s. And the hallmark of 1920s creative endeavors, whether it's visual art, whether it's literature, whether it's music, anything like that, is 3 things. It's aware of its form. It tends to be quite minimalistic. And it's very aware of the technological world that it's in, which is a contrast to, say, romantic literature like Jane Austen that is nostalgic for the old English countryside. And all 3 of these things apply to this book. It's aware of the form. If for people who haven't read it, it's released in 2 parts. The first part is set in the 1860s. The second part is a flashback to the 1840s. So he was using the literary device that everybody associates with people like Marcel Proust, again, quintessential 20s author, said it's minimal, that said that these works tend to be minimalistic. This is written as a guy's journal in his apartment as he's having what we'd now call an existential crisis. It's not an elaborate storyline. It's a guy's notes to himself. And awareness of technology. You mentioned the Crystal Palace. That's one of the most famous symbols from this book. So it's almost a 1920s work of modernist literature that comes out of the year 1864. You also said that I have my thesis that that our society is stuck in an auto loop that started about 100 years ago. The thing that you do have to understand about this book is it's completely a product of the 1860s. The historical context about this book is that 1861 was when Russia had freed the serfs. And that, like so many great ideas from the magnanimous intellectual class, it wasn't working out so well. So the reaction to that was what we call Russian nihilism, the idea that we have to get rid of everything, not just the conservative ideas, but all the progressive ideas up to this point as well, and start from zero. One of the main thinkers of the time was a man named Nikolai Chernyshevsky. He wrote a utopian novel at the time that featured the Crystal Palace as a utopian symbol. This book, Lenin cited it as the reason that he permanently decided to become a revolutionary. It's called What Is to Be Done. This book, that Dostoevsky wrote in 1864, was a direct rebuttal and a response to that, saying, hold on, your utopian ideas about how we're going to build this brilliant, rational society, it's really not going to work. And here are my reasons, A, B, C, D, and E, for why I don't think this is going to work. So you have to place this book in the 1860s, in this very specific time and place. The 1860s is also when Tolstoy wrote War and Peace. It seems like a lot of the famous and important works of literature and of any creative endeavor always seem to follow a very, important historical inflection point, and this is no exception.
Well, and what's interesting about it too is for those who have read Spengler's Decline of the West, Spengler talks about the dichotomy within Russian society and that Russian culture has always, at least at the time from the 1800s or so on, since its real serious contact with the West has been, in a sense, put upon by Western European ideas. And in that sense, the essential Russianness of Russia is, in a sense, overwhelmed or overshadowed or threatened by Western ideas. And so there is a sense that, this is what, Spengler says he says, Tolstoy's Christianity was a misunderstanding. He spoke of Christ, but meant Marx. But to Dostoevsky's Christianity, the next 1,000 years will belong, right? And so Spengler uses that as a long assessment of what he believes to be the essence of Christianity and so forth, and goes through sort of what that is. And what Spengler argues is that Dostoevsky is trying to capture an essential Russian idea of Russia without, and separating it from, in a sense, what he believes sort of the corrupting influence of Western Europe. And Notes from Underground explores, in a sense, what happens to people under the influence of the West in that sense. And so he takes, in the first portion of the book, when he's looking at the Crystal Palace, he begins to expose the fundamental contradiction of the Enlightenment West. So on the one hand, with the Enlightenment West, you have this idea of personal freedom and personal choice, that we are free human beings, and that, the idea of personal sovereignty and so forth. But yet on the other hand, there is this notion that we can, through science and reason, we can engineer, in a sense, the perfect utopian society. And so he says this idea of human progress, as symbolized in the Crystal Palace, which I think was built from start to finish in 90 days, sort of a marvel of modern engineering and the application of technique and so forth. And so Dostoevsky uses this as a symbol to explore. And what he basically argues, he says, if you succeed in the world of the Crystal Palace, he says, you will extinguish the notion of human freedom. And he says that human freedom, and here's the interesting thing, and he draws it, he says, if human beings didn't see fit to obey God and were willing to rebel against God, what hope do you think that they're going to rebel against? And there's this lovely little sequence, and I think I've quoted to you, which this is perhaps my favorite part of the whole book. And Dostoevsky contrasts this with a notion of, he calls it consciousness, but I think it's more of like consciousness of God, of the world, sort of almost like the old Christian biblical wisdom tradition in that regard, right? And he goes through a couple times and he talks about the sort of mathematics of this thing of 2 + 2 = 4. And he says 2 + 2 = 4 is the symbol of the Crystal Palace and the world of technological achievement. And he says this, but 2 × 2 = 4 is, after all, something insufferable. 2 × 2 = 4 seems to me simply a piece of insolence. 2 × 2 = 4 is a fop standing with arms akimbo, barring your path and spitting. I admit that 2 × 2 = 4 is an excellent thing, but if we're going to praise everything, 2 × 2 = 5 is sometimes also a very charming little thing. And then on the next page, he goes on to this to talk about consciousness, for instance, is infinitely superior to 2 × 2 = 4. Once you have 2 × 2 = 4, there's nothing left to do or to understand. There will be nothing left but to bottle up your 5 senses and plunge into contemplation. While if you stick to consciousness, even though you attain the same result, you can at least flog yourself at times, and that will at any rate liven you up. It may be reactionary, but corporal punishment is still better than nothing. And it's just sort of like, to me, that's kind of like there it is. There's the world you're trying to build, and this is the end result, is that, you will turn yourself into a prisoner that will squeeze all of the life out of life.
Well, I think he goes even one step farther than that. He talks about how, when the stupid man runs into an obstacle, he recognizes it's an obstacle and he just moves on to the next thing. But those of us who are enlightened, who think a little too hard, when we run into an obstacle, we just get hung up on it and we have to think, okay, how do we get around this? Even if it's something as simple as 2 × 2 = 4, something that everybody recognizes is true. He says, we all know 2 × 2 = 4, and yet we sensible underground men, we still want to come up with a way to get around this. And then a couple of chapters later, he completely contradicts himself by saying, now we want to reduce all of human behavior to a formula so that we can predict everything. So he even contradicts himself within a couple of chapters. He says, first of all, we hate the fact that math gives us these limitations that we can't work around. And then what's the next thing we want to do is we want to reduce all of society to a formula so that we can control it.
Yeah. And the fun of it, he says, and if we do that, he says, on the other hand, we're also claiming that human beings are free moral creatures. He says, if you build the world you're going to get, you're going to erase human freedom. And this is a sense of like, you're thinking to yourself like, Dostoevsky totally understood the world that, the AI specialists are trying to build, in a sense that, hey, if we can make these math calculations fast enough in real time with powerful enough computers, we can actually achieve the world of complete, orderly government. We can manage everything.
Well, yeah, he says everything can be reduced to logistics until you have the one guy who comes along and says, I am going to do the thing that's not in my best interest because I want to feel like a human being. And he says, how do you have any mathematical equation that controls for that? Now, just maybe this is getting a little esoteric here, but if you've ever taken a class in symbolic logic, you know that in the early 20th century, they were trying to reduce all of mathematics to a list of axioms. And a guy named Gödel comes along and says, what do you do about the statement, this computer will never prove this statement is true. How do you get a computer to say that? Well, you can't. You're always going to run into some sort of self-reference. And I always assumed this was something from the 20s and 30s, that these mathematicians and philosophers were thinking about questions like this. But Dostoevsky was very clearly aware and thinking of the exact same thing when he said that your whole logical system breaks down when you have the one person who self-referentially says, I am going to do something that's not in my own best interest.
Well, and this is the thing, is that, and Gödel's theorem is kind of elegant in the sense that, that for those that are not aware, and this is the whole thing, is that you cannot explain everything. The idea that you can explain the whole universe mathematically, Gödel argues, is just simply false, because you can't account for mathematics with mathematics.
Well,
you need something outside of the system of mathematics to justify mathematics. And he says, if you're trying then to account for everything in the universe via mathematics, and everything is all like the whole universe can be explained mathematically, he says, you in a sense can't do it because you can't create a system big enough to account for mathematics within the universe.
Well, it's more that he was saying there's no way of getting around self-reference. Like,
yeah.
For example, saying this statement is false, that creates a paradox, but maybe that's a small example. But now
or the one of like, there is no truth.
Yeah.
Right. Well, you just asserted a truth.
Yeah. So, the next step is always the following statement is true and the previous statement is false. Well, that ends up with some sort of self-reference. Well, Gödel's statement was that there is no way of getting around self-reference.
Yeah.
And the example I gave is trying to program a computer to prove the sentence, this computer will never prove that this sentence is true. There will always be statements that are true, but cannot be proven by your system of logic. And again, not to go too far down the mathematical rabbit hole here, but this is very much what Dostoevsky was talking about when he says, in the one breath, you want to reduce everything to a question of logistics. When you come up with a big enough equation that says exactly what you're going to be doing in 30 years, what do you do when the person comes along and self-referentially says, you know what, my happiness depends on me breaking this rational system?
Well, and that's the thing, is he argues that, and this is the whole thing, because it gets to, I think it's what Mill, who's talks about, enlightened self interest, and that you build a morality around, and that you can, in a sense, the free market works because you base it on a system of enlightened self-interest. And so the assumption is that everybody's going to always be working out for their best interests. And Dostoevsky just simply points out, he says, well, that's not the case. He says there's all kinds of people who know what their best interest is and do something completely different, that's self-destructive or whatever, in spite of knowing what the best interest is. So he says the whole system sort of breaks down because people don't look out for their best interest. And if you tell them mathematically, well, this is what your best interest is and this is what you should do, is that once people are told that and knowing that, they will still go ahead and do something completely different that's not in their best interest.
Okay, so that's actually the perfect segue for something I was looking to bring up. So I said that Notes from Underground was a response to a book by Nikolai Chernyshevsky. What Chernyshevsky was specifically trying to do was import English utilitarianism into Russia. That you talked about bringing Western ideas in general, but specifically it was utilitarianism apropos of Mill. And so Dostoevsky was just saying here, even if the English have some way of making it work within the English cultural boundaries that keep a lid on things, trying to take this British idea of reducing everything to a formula or a machine and bringing this into Russia. Are you sure this is a good idea to import a foreign idea here and not even thinking about it? In fact, I think from about chapter 7 onwards, he's the book is him writing in his journal, but he keeps saying, gentlemen, 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 do you think this? Gentlemen, do you think that? He's specifically talking to the followers of Chernyshevsky who are trying to import English utilitarianism. I mean, you mentioned Mill. That's why I'm bringing that up here. But so the version of it that Chernyshevsky tried to bring in was a much, more harsh version of it. He called it rational egoism. And even that name tells you that we're going to take what the English did, and we Russians, we are great mathematicians. We're going to, be more English than the English. Well, that just doesn't really work.
Well, no. And in this regard, I think that Dostoevsky just sort of exposes just sort of the inner contradictions to the whole project. And that's really, I think sort of where you end up with kind of in the second half of the book, because Dostoevsky's also begins to explore, because he's looking not just at the Crystal Palace, but he's looking at the managerial world of Russia at the time, sort of the sense of working in the bureaus, and he sees the connection between the work of this man from underground and his work in the bureaus and the kind of man that staffs it so there's a dichotomy in a sense where this world is promising a certain thing. In a sense, we talk about it today as meritocracy, right? And so the smartest people are supposed to rise to the top, right? And so this man from underground is somebody who basically he's educated, he's read all the books, he's smarter than everybody else. And the system has, in a sense, told him that you are supposed to be on top of the world, and yet he's not. And Dostoevsky is pointing out that all of the promises you make about the system, that the smartest, most rational, that all of the very best and brightest are going to run this system, and they're going to mathematically figure out all the problems of the world, and they're going to, through the glories of science and engineering, actually instantiate the Crystal Palace. And Dostoevsky then looks at it and he goes, well, okay, here's the kind of person who's supposed to succeed in the world that you're wanting to create, but the world doesn't work that way. And sort of sits him in a sort of an actual social environment and then shows who actually succeeds.
Yeah, so a couple of things. The first is it's not just that, he says smart people think the world is going to work this way. Because it's written as a journal,
he sort of shows
where he's self-conscious about things. I think he has a guilty conscience because he knows that it's not going to work. And I think he thinks everybody else knows it's not going to work as well, but you have to pretend it's going to work to keep up appearances.
Well, you have to in a sense, but at the same time, he's bitter that he's not wildly successful because the world that he knows isn't going to work was promising that it was going to work and that he would be on top. And so now he's bitter.
Yeah. So again, we got to look at the historical context here. Like I said, the first part of the book was set in the 1860s. The second part in the 1840s. You talked about bringing in ideas from the rest of Europe and imposing it on Russia. Now, this has been happening probably since the age of Ivan the Terrible, who was contemporary with Henry VIII, and maybe arguably even earlier than that. This has gone through many, many iterations. If you read, accounts of if you read accounts of the World War II and the run up to it that are not steeped in post 1945 propaganda, that even frames the rivalry between Stalin and Trotsky in these terms. Was it really a clash of ideologies, or was it just the guy who liked Russian or Eastern traditions wanting to kick out the Jewish Trotsky, who was into Western international traditions. I've heard that argument made as well. But for most of the 19th century and the earliest 20th, and for most of the 19th century and for the early 20th century, the iteration of this dichotomy was called the Westernizers and the Slavophiles.
Yes.
And that term comes out of the 1840s. This is when Romanticism from Western Europe was applied to Russia, and the Russian intelligentsia almost had, let's say romantic ideas. I know that's somewhat self-referential saying they had romantic ideas about Romanticism, but the generation of intellectuals from the 1840s, they just thought that these enlightened ideas have finally been brought in. Specifically, they were brought in 1812 when Napoleon tried invading. Napoleon lost, but a lot of these fancy ideas from France, stayed in St. Petersburg and in Moscow. And the second half of Dostoevsky's book really is about the optimism of the 1840s, these people who had these feel-good vibes of European liberalism, thinking that we are intelligent, we can sit around having these smart ideas all the time. The narrator of Notes from Underground gets himself invited to a party, or at least a dinner party of these.
Or invites himself to the dinner party.
Oh, yeah. I said he gets himself invited. Yes.
He gets himself invited, yeah.
Another trope that comes out of this time is the reformed prostitute in Russian liberal literature. These rational ideas are going to redeem humanity. Well, basically, a huge part of the second part of Dostoevsky's book turns that trope completely on its head, where he tries to start up a relationship with a prostitute thinking he's going to reform her. And then, after he's given his grandiose speeches, she tells him, I'm not doing this by choice. I'm doing this because my mother sold me into sex slavery. And he's like, how do I answer this at all? That's when the book gets a little bit dark. So what Dostoevsky is doing in the second part of this book is it's a critique of the 1840s. And just as people in our circle, a lot of them say, geez, we need to go back to the 90s, not realizing that the feel-good vibes of the 90s were what caused the wokeness and the nihilism of today. This is an exact parallel. You said that book could have been written today. He is exactly saying that the naivety of the 1840s were what caused the brutal utilitarianism of the 1860s, when we thought it would be just a great idea to free the serfs, and now you have a bunch of starving peasants on our hands.
Well, and this is, in a sense, the stories are the backdrop for, because he writes the portion of the commentary on the Crystal Palace first, that lays the backdrop of all of these things that are happening in the second half. And so you realize that his failures with the prostitute, there's the sense of there's the kind of thing like, do you really think that the Crystal Palace is going to fix this? Right? That 2 + 2 = 4 is going to fix this?
Well, or that, just like the person who wants to act against his own self-interest is the one thing that doesn't fit into the equation, and you'll never make it fit into the equation. He had this brilliant story in his head of how he was going to explain to a prostitute how she's going to get her life straightened up. And then she told him something that didn't fit into the equation at all, that, you're not doing this by choice. You're a sex slave whose family sold you into this.
And so the question is then, well, what does 2 + 2 = 4 do with that? What is your brilliant? And this is the sort of contrast, because he's always in the back of his mind. He's developing these grand plans of how everything is going to work out. And so you can see him that even as he criticizes the Crystal Palace, he is a man who embodies the kind of the spirit of the Crystal Palace, in a sense of he's got every sort of thing, how it's going to happen, kind of minutely planned. That, in a sense, there is a kind of vibes attitude to it. Like he's going to have the duel with Zherkov, and he's going to slap him in his face. And it never happens, right? And he's going to, and he had pictures of exactly how this is all going to go. And so he's got his whole life sort of in this moment arranged as 2 + 2 = 4, but then he lacks the will to make it happen.
Yeah, but he also says that the 1860s is the age of the most, refined bloodshedders. He says those of us who have reduced everything to an equation and are not men of action, we're proper people who are willing to start the world's biggest wars. Also, keep in mind what happened in the 1860s. It was the age of Otto von Bismarck starting wars to unify Germany. It's the decade of the American Civil War. It's the decade of Napoleon III, who was supporting the wars to unify Italy. Again, you can't take this out of the historical context of the 1860s. He says we've ended up in a time of refined bloodshedders. And also keep in mind what else is written at this time. This is when Thomas Carlyle wrote Shooting Niagara, where he says, okay, we're entering this world of free trade and complete freedom. And it seems like we are cutting all of the ropes and shackles that held humanity back. And it seems like the 20th century is going to be a huge century of bloodshed. This came out of the 1860s as well. And that sentiment could have been written by Thomas Carlyle or by Dostoevsky when Dostoevsky talks about this idea of the most refined bloodshedders ever.
Well, and it's interesting too, because you then have there's all like, this is the wonderful thing about the thing I also too enjoy about a Kierkegaard as well too, is that, there's one thing to be said for sort of straightforward, just discursive philosophy. But when you're doing philosophy the way that Dostoevsky is doing it, is that he's able to layer it in ways that allow the point to sort of speak from between the story, so to speak, out of the things that are left, that aren't being openly said, but are sort of being shown to you in the story. And the kind of people that are actually running the world are these sort of genial midwits. And they read enough that they're not stupid. They're cultured enough that they're somewhat refined, but they're not like the high-end performers. And it's very obvious that, our man from underground is smarter, better read, and so forth, and all of these men that but at the same time, they're the ones who succeed in the world. And he's left sort of embittered in his little hovel in the corner, underpaid and so forth. And you can almost sense that, like if you read somebody like Turchin, you talk about the disaffected intellectuals and the overproduced elites and so forth, right? Well, the guys who are succeeding are the Zherkovs, and the men from underground are the ones that are cast aside, but they're also the ones that are signing up for Lenin down the road as well too, to make sure that they can punish the Zherkovs of the world.
Well, even in the first chapter of this book, he has a line there saying that a man of the 19th century must be both characterless and a man of character.
Yes. Which is it, and the whole thing is just, and what's really interesting is just how prescient he is about what's to come. Like, and this is, I think, like you could read this book like it was written in the 1950s or the 1990s, and yet it's written in the middle of the 1800s, and you're like, that's the mind-boggling thing about, coming back to this book again, is just realizing like, oh my word, this could be just written today. Like you think to yourself of the incel, like the man from underground would have a Substack and be an incel and would be, typing angrily into his computer today. And he would be the brightest man in the world. And he couldn't fathom how, the vice president isn't, in his DMs, looking to seek, problems for the solutions to the Middle East, because he has them all.
Well, Dostoevsky even says at one point that, the Zherkovs of the world, or the refined civil servants. These people talk about wanting to be a cog in the machine as if it's a good thing. Like you want to talk about something that foresees the 20th century. I think about like the stereotypical boomer who, could work any job he wanted and had a completely cushy life. And what did he want to do? He wanted to complain all the time about having to work for the man and not having any individuality. Like that Bob Seger song. My parents are boomers, God bless them, but they like Bob Seger, and Bob Seger had that song "I Feel Like a Number," which is one of the.
And the thing is, they're not. And this is the thing that Dostoevsky points out in pointing out consciousness. Right? They're not conscious enough to see the internal contradictions, and yet the boomers are the Zherkovs of the world. And that's in the regard to sort of easygoing, everything works well for them, just go ask her for a date, just ask her out, or, pull up your socks, just work a little harder, son, you'll be fine. You know what I mean? It's just, it worked out for me. It'll be all fine for you, and Dostoevsky's like this little angry man and, banging away at his keyboard and it's not working out for the man from underground, and yet it should be. And he's angry and he's conscious of the fact that, why are all of these midwits in charge of things, and they're happy-go-lucky and they have no idea to the contrary. And yet I, who am conscious, I'm the one that's stuck here in my little hovel and blah, 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 blah. And he's just, just stewing in his own hate.
Have you read Dostoevsky's book, The Demons, which was written a couple years after this?
No, I have it on my shelf and I probably should pick it up and read it, but no.
So this contrast between the laid-back optimism of the 1840s and the more brutal reality of the utilitarianism of the 1860s is also a theme of that book. That book features a father who was this 1840s intellectual who is essentially just a boomer. Everything has worked out for him in life. He got hired to be the private tutor of rich widow's children. And after they were grown, she just kept him around as her boy toy. And he did nothing but spend his days writing poetry and hosting salons and talking about just how oppressed he was by the Tsar, even though everybody knew this guy just had the most cushy life ever. And, he just lives into old age and just ends up dying. And people said, all right, he lived a cushy life, but did he die a meaningful life? Now, his son in the 1860s went off to university and comes back with this much more radical version of liberalism. And, without spoiling anything about the book, he ends up creating some subversive organizations that do some quite illegal things. And the father doesn't approve of his son's much more radical ideology. You should be thinking much more like us 1840s boomers who just sit around philosophizing and writing poetry all day, not realizing, all that great philosophizing doesn't matter when you've raised a radical son who's willing to burn things down. And so you want to talk about how the people from the 1840s are the ones who really end up running the world, the people who are naively optimistic but play the game and things just happen to work out for them. I think he hashes out that theme a lot more in this book, which was written 6 or 7 years later. The Demons, you said, right? Yeah, Demons, yep.
It's and this I think is also, in a sense, the sort of the abiding theme of, I think, the whole, this whole thing of managerialism, in a sense, that it's still like this basic thing is still with us today. Mm-hmm. The people who think that they deserve the success versus the people who actually have the success. And I think in a sense, what Dostoevsky is arguing is that there's no way to get around this fundamental contradiction, that the people you think are supposed to be running the system never actually do.
So when you talk about managerialism having a disconnect between the people who deserve success and who get success, I think it's even more simple than that, that there's a certain type of person who wants to put this managerial system in place because he honestly believes it's going to work, and he wants to be the savior of humanity who developed this utopian system. And you want to talk about the symbolism of the Crystal Palace. So you mentioned Kierkegaard earlier as well. It seems like all of the major dissidents of the 19th century, and when I say dissident, I mean people who don't believe in the cult of progress. Mm-hmm. They all come out of this period.
Nietzsche the same.
1960s, and this is the Crystal Palace was built for the London exhibition in 1851. Even the biggest British dissenters like Carlyle and Ruskin and William Morris, they came out of this time period as well. William Morris, he was probably an autist. Some people thought he had Tourette's syndrome. I think he was probably just a twitchy nerd. In many ways, people think he was the original Tolkien. But his parents wanted to take him to the exhibition in 1851, and he was so uncomfortable with this big soulless Crystal Palace that he refused to go in. Just as a teenager, he just wanted to sit outside and didn't want to go in and see this showcase of the glory of the British Empire. And I think we all know teenagers who are like that. It seems like, during the Enlightenment, all of the philosophers were on the same page. Philosophy was viewed as a cumulative endeavor. Then the French Revolution happens and that whole thing falls apart, and you get the rise of Romanticism and different rival cathedrals in the world of philosophy. You've got the German idealists and the positivists and the utilitarians. And, later on you have the irrationalists and the Russian nihilists, and you have this whole, taxonomy of different philosophies in the 19th century. Then in the 20th century, under American hegemony and the expanded university system, now philosophy is not a bunch of rival cathedrals anymore. Now it's almost professionalized. If you want to be a philosopher, you get a job for a university and spend your whole life studying the minutia of one very narrow topic, talking about the, ethics of feminism in 1920s literature or whatever it is. It seems like the 19th century was really the only time when you could have had this level of dissent, because this is the only time when you had all these different rival cathedrals in philosophy and all of these dissenting thinkers, Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and Carlyle, all these people seem to come out of this same period. Of course, you had a couple of earlier ones like Joseph de Maistre, and the real dissenter par excellence came after World War I, and that's Oswald Spengler. He was the guy who wasn't just a dissenter of the cult of progress. He was the guy who smashed the whole thing. But it seems like all of these thinkers from the time who make us think, why do they make us think? Because they're all questioning the cult of progress. And we are at a time in history when the cult of progress seems to have completely failed.
Yeah, well, I'm not even sure necessarily that the cult of progress had failed. It was, in a sense,
well, I don't think it had failed.
It was succeeding, and that was, I think, the thing that frightened these guys. These were guys who looked at the cult of progress and were able to see sort of what it was. There was a sense where before the cult of progress became domesticated, and it was like a true sort of triumphal ideology. These guys looked at it and they saw the internal flaws and began to speak about it at a time when, most people didn't really want to listen. and said, here's just, and they played it out. Like, this is basically, they told people that this is what it is.
Yep.
And,
well, like I said,
and nobody listened to them.
Well, like I said, this book was specifically a response to a utopian novel that was espousing the glory of the cult of progress. So no, I mean, I agree that the cult of progress was succeeding. It was right in the middle of the Industrial Revolution. How could it not have been? When I said it failed, I mean, I think it's failed now. I think now it's really hard to look back on the last 200 years and say that the cult of progress is still going strong. I don't think it's been going strong since about the 1970s, possibly even earlier than that.
Yeah, well, no, and that was the point that, say, somebody like Joseph Tainter made, that, and he looked at it from, rather than from a philosophical point of view, looked at it from just in a sense that the internal not so much internal contradictions, but that just from a sort of a cost benefit analysis, that the notion, when you look at civilization itself as a problem solving mechanism, and that with every problem you solve, and you need to solve the problems or your civilization will die, that with every layer of problem that you solve, there becomes a part of the system is eaten up, sustaining the solution for that problem. And as with every layer, so what begins to happen is that over time, the number of solutions that a society produces, the cost of maintaining those solutions begin to eat into the total prosperity of the society, until there's such a point where the inputs required to bring out results no longer match, and you need ever greater, and you sort of plateau, and then you have a kind of a law of diminishing returns. Your own civilization and its sort of essence and whatever it is just reaches a point where it passes the point of diminishing returns, and then some form of collapse is inevitable.
Yeah, the cult of progress becomes the cargo cult of progress as you try to make progress.
And then, and as our other friend of the show, Black Horses, went to note, he says, yes, you could look at it structurally. He says, but as civilizations expand and imperial power progresses, and progresses, in the non-ideological sense, that all of these solutions become patronage problems. So they become vehicles for gathering and accumulating power as well. And so not only fixing it is not just merely a structural problem, it's also a patronage problem, in the sense that you can't just simply get rid of solutions that are no longer working, or lean things up, or whatever, you know what I mean? Pare things back and cut back on the architecture of the system that's maintaining the solutions of society, because all of those solutions are themselves patronage things that keep society peaceful. And if you were to pull them all back, you create the seeds for revolution and the collapse of society.
Well, I mean, go ahead.
No, go on.
I was just going to say, I mean, this goes back to the question of, like, what are we trying to accomplish in the first place? Is it just our elites are trying to gather power for themselves and nothing else? Are they actually trying to propagate the culture or the society? I mean, I think you have to answer that question before you can answer, am I doing this the proper way? And I think when you look around, certainly when you look at our elites, I'm not sure what they're even trying to accomplish, what they're trying to, preserve as a going concern, or are they just trying to maintain appearances with people who have even more power than they do? What problem are they trying to solve before we can even talk about doing it in a hyper rational way or not?
Well, and I think this is the sense of, and who was it that, Actually, I think it was Peter Thiel's 0 to 1, where he talked about magical thinking. And it's interesting, like you think like a book on business advice or whatever, startups or whatever, but Thiel is a surprisingly deeper thinker than maybe he's given credit for on the surface. And even a business book like 0 to 1 has 4 or 5 really good points in it. And one of the points that he made is that this notion of magical thinking. And so he's trying to contrast the idea of intentionality. So he says, startups and solving problems have to be intentional. And you have to kind of know what problem you're solving and then have a plan for solving it. And he says that much of society today is in magical thinking. And he calls both the managerial system and its absence both forms of magical thinking, in a sense, because the managerial system, as Ellul also notes, focuses very much on process. So if we get if we get the process right, then, and we get the system of managerial techniques, if we perfect them, then what will emerge from this is the correct solution, right? The other thing he says is if we sweep away all of these managerial things and just let the market perform itself, that all of those interactions of everybody on the market will just naturally produce a solution. And he says both of these are magical thinking. Now, I'm not convinced necessarily that his intentionality, in a sense of it harkens back to the philosophy of the Crystal Palace, but I think his analysis of process thinking is fundamentally correct, that it's a kind of magical thinking. So it comes down to, like, in a sense of when you get back to something like Dostoevsky, is he's recognizing that this idea that we can fix all of the problems in society by applying mathematics, which is itself a form of magical thinking, because in the sense of if we apply sort of the engineering things, and if we use the proper things of like math, science, and engineering, then we will be able to solve all of our problems. And Dostoevsky points out the internal contradictions to this. But then the question comes into is, well, what is the alternative? And that, I think, is maybe a little bit harder to suss out from a book like Notes from Underground. There are a few allusions to Pushkin, where he talks about, when he had read Pushkin, and, so there's a sense of, like you say, alluding to this sort of earlier romantic, highly, Russian time. But I think there's also something of as you say, as he looks back to that older world of the happy-go-lucky midwits, is there something in there that he's pointing to us to say, like, it's probably, the solution probably lies with these guys and not with the guy from Underground with his hyper consciousness, if that makes sense. Like, does that make sense as a kind of a thesis of what Dostoevsky's trying to do there?
Yeah, I'm not sure I agree with that. I think I completely agree with you're saying, with your point that he's criticizing magical thinking. At one point, he says,
or is there no solution in the book?
Yeah, well, he specifically says that his colleagues are just so sure and so confident that they will be able to teach man to love his role as a cog in the machine. Again, what was Soviet ideology but exactly that? But he says once we can teach man to enjoy his role as a cog in the machine, then man is just going to follow the laws of nature. So it just becomes a scientific question, and we just need to figure out the laws of nature. And then it becomes a mathematical question. We just need to calculate a formula, and then there's no... at one point he says there's, quote, no action and no adventure, because everything just vanishes with the mathematical precision you have. And he says, you want to talk about magical thinking? Like, let's go right back to the beginning of that chain. We are going to teach men to love their role as a cog in the machine. That's already magical thinking, let alone 2 or 3 steps down that chain. and you want to go to the modern world, you're presupposing man is just going to be happy to go into the rational framework. In Canada, we've imported half of India in the last 5 years, thinking that they're just going to get with the program and get along with Canada's idea of peace, order, and good governance. Completely surprised that they come here and the first thing they do is start running scams, every scam they can. Like, the magical thinking is just right at the first part of this chain. So Dostoevsky says you don't even need to think about step 2, 3, or 4. You just need to think, all right, already at the beginning, we are starting from a bad premise. So what are we even doing here?
And maybe the quite thing is that, I'm expecting more from the book, and maybe this is the thing that part of that, and I always have to remind myself, and this is one of the things I have to do constantly, is that thinking that there's a solution is actually part of the problem. If that's, you know what I mean? And that's kind of the thing that I have to constantly remind myself is like, and this is why people say like of Ellul that he's constantly blackpilling you. And when you go into and you read Ellul, the worst parts of his books are like the last 2 chapters when he begins to talk about solutions, because you just realize that like, none of this works, and actually having a solution is that's the Crystal Palace, and you're sitting there thinking like, so there are no solutions.
Well, again, remember that the whole point of the book is the contrast between the 1840s and the 1860s. And like I said, the book, The Demons, is also the contrast between the 1840s and the 1860s. The 1840s thinkers, they're the boomers. And in The Demons, does that ever resolve? No, he just dies and is forgotten. The boomer just dies and is forgotten. Trying to come up with a solution to the problem of managerialism, that's like trying to fix the boomers at this point, trying to get them to stop watching the TV. That's
and the problem is trying to fix the problems of managerialism is actually, that's what managerialism is, right? So in a sense, and this comes back to Gödel's theorem, right? Can you, and there's a sense of there is no solution to managerialism from within managerialism.
No.
And that's the thing I think that people have to realize is that from within the system, there is no solution.
Well, the other thing you have to realize is that Dostoevsky was not coming up with anything novel by saying that.
No.
So in Western Europe, liberalism and capitalism and all this good stuff, it really comes out of the reforms in the early 1830s. And there was a French thinker named Pierre Leroux, who was actually the guy who coined the term socialism. And he coined the term socialism as a negative thing. But like so many things, people ran with the word, and he ended up calling himself a socialist by the end of his life.
Wow.
He said, I believe in the cult of progress. I believe in moving forward, but we have to make sure we don't go too far to either end of the spectrum. On the one spectrum, you have individualism, which he already thought the British were taking too far with the whole nation of shop owners and everything. He says you just want to reduce everything to having a gendarmerie or a police station in every village to enforce the laws. He says, first of all, you do something like that, all of the wealth is going to accumulate in a very few people. And more importantly, even if you believe that's okay, what's going to stop bad actors from coming in and just trying to game the system by saying, I'm technically not breaking the law? So he says that's the one bad extreme. And I think, in the modern world, we see lots of people doing that. But the other bad extreme was what he called socialism. And again, I stress, he used this as a negative term. He says these people who want to say we're going to deal with the problem of evil by creating this vast system of rules that don't allow people to do the wrong thing, and that's just going to suck the humanity out of everything. What is he describing? What managerialism here? The word socialism was originally used as a negative term to describe what we would now call managerialism. And this was the 1830s, not the 1860s.
Yeah, and the thing is here with managerialism is that I think people get caught up in 20th century dichotomies, in a sense, freedom versus totalitarianism. And the real problem, and I think this is the thing that Dostoevsky is so good at pointing out, is that the true crime of the system is nihilism. And I think that's a sort of the empty, the kind of the emptiness of the life that the world creates, that this world creates, is this real kind, like you think of something like Canada today. Like, I mean, we functionally live in a quasi totalitarian state. We all believe that we're free, but yet the vast majority of us live utterly empty lives.
Well, it's almost tautological when you say that, because nihilism was the predominant Russian philosophy of the intellect, of the Westernizers of that branch of the Russian intelligentsia in the 1860s. Like I said, nihilism was specifically, we freed the serfs. We thought it was going to work, and oh shit, it's not working now. What do we do about this? Well, we have to come up with a completely new ideology that is so progressive that we are going to disavow the previous generations of progressives every bit as much as we disavow the conservatives. So, I mean, you're right, he's criticizing nihilism, but he's almost explicitly criticizing nihilism, because that it's not just an abstract word the way it would be now. That was the prevailing school of philosophical thought that Chernyshevsky belonged to. Again, Chernyshevsky was a Westernizer. He was a huge Westernizer. And Dostoevsky was a Slavophile or an anti-Westernizer. So, I mean, you're right that he's criticizing nihilism, but I don't know if there's a lot of content in saying that. That's like saying I'm against managerialism right now. Well, yes, I am, but that's because managerialism is the dominant ideology that's running the country and probably strangling us right now.
Yeah, and it's see, and this is the thing that it's very, I think for a lot of people, they just don't see the point, in a sense of, because you're sort of like a fish in water, that you don't realize the degree to which you're wet and the degree to which the world of the Crystal Palace now pervades everything that we do and are. And we don't grasp what life could be like otherwise. I think, and outside of sort of this way of thinking and doing about the world. And, people have the life sucked out of them, but they don't even realize that the life is being sucked out of them. They're becoming angry and bitter, but they don't even understand. On one level, they kind of understand why they're angry and bitter, but they on another level, that they don't get it at all. Like, in the sense that they don't really understand what they might do to sort of break out of it. And this is, I think, kind of the sort of the tragic whole, because we've been told that all of your needs can be satisfied materially. And so people just begin to sort of double and triple down on, the material satisfactions that the modernity, and sort of Western capitalism has provided, not realizing that in doing so, they are just sort of buying into the system even further.
Well, what even is the frame that we want to break out of? I mean, you just used the word capitalism there. It seems like our entire political lexicon is from before World War I. Liberalism, conservatism, capitalism, communism, socialism, progress, everything comes from the world that World War II swept away and just replaced with a gigantic bureaucratic system. And I think they're happy to let us use all this old vocabulary. We don't use any vocabulary that, is relevant to the world post 1945, because by not using those words, we can't even conceptualize things properly. And you'd have to conceptualize it before you can break out of the frame.
Well, and this is like Ellul hints of this in places. Other authors, there's Aaron Holt, who writes about community, talks about this, and that we don't understand, in a sense, the world that was taken from us, because we don't live in it anymore, so we don't experience it, so we don't know anymore. And all we see is the world that we've built for ourselves. And this is one of the things why I find Tolkien so intriguing, because he painted a kind of word picture of the Shire. And there's this recognition, like you think to yourself, oh yeah, like a nation of shopkeepers and so forth. But Tolkien also made the argument that in order for the Shire to work, you need something like Aragorn and, the good king and Gondor off in the distance. And you need to have a few men in your village, in your community, who understand the heroic and are willing to fend off the enemies, both within and without, and to, in a sense, rule over the people. But yet at the same time, there's a kind of pastoral egalitarianism about the community. The lords are not lording it over people. They're just kind of doing what's necessary. And it's interesting, kind of the picture that he tries to create for people in contrast to the machine world of Isengard and Mordor, which I think maybe the contrasts were drawn a little too much in that regard, because I think somebody like, if you think of the machine world of Isengard as Dostoevsky's Man from Underground and that bureaucratic nightmare, that's probably a better contrast in some ways.
Well, you also got to remember that The Hobbit was written 5 years after Brave New World was. So
yes,
it was already a callback to a society that Tolkien was nostalgic for, that in many ways didn't exactly exist. Brave New World, we talked about modernist literature of the 20s. I know it came out in 1931, but I think Brave New World was one of the classic examples of 1920s modernist literature that, like I said, Notes from Underground seems like it was written in the 1920s, even though it was written 60 years earlier than that. So, I mean, I absolutely agree that Tolkien was criticizing that sort of world. I think he was doing it explicitly so. There was a certain sentimentality, not just with Tolkien, but with society in general, that World War I completely swept aside. And I think that Tolkien was in many ways trying to ask, how do we preserve this pre-World War I romantic sentimentality about, the pastoral world, about nature, about nationalism, when this new post-World War I society is trying to sweep it all away.
But yet at the same time, it's like, even as Tolkien harkens back and talks about this world, it is unfortunately still at the same time what's the right word? It's nostalgic, and the problem is that you can't go back. And
Yep.
and I think this is the thing that the point that Spengler makes so clearly, is that you can't go back. It is just simply going to play itself out to the end. And, and this is why, I think like Spengler, like optimism is what is it? No, what's the saying from Spengler? Optimism is cowardice. That's it. Optimism is cowardice. And that's the sense of that, like, if you think that if you have hope that you can fix things, that you can bring the old days back, or you can things, Spengler's just there to argue you don't understand how civilizations work. The end will come, and it's just You are in the time that you're in the history, like the spot in the empire that you're in, and you can see all of its tragic flaws, but there's nothing that you can do about it.
Well, that almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy when Spengler published his book, and it changed a lot of minds after World War One. A lot of intellectuals and creatives, the people who create our culture, said, all right, I guess we are just living in the clearinghouse of a previous society. We're in a fire sale where we're selling everything off. So why not make the most of this? When I talk in the art world, this is when you get the Dada movement and the such. These people were absolutely affected by the writings of Spengler. They said it opened their eyes and said, well, if we're just living in the decline of civilization anyways, we might as well make art that is apropos of the decline of civilization. I think that is the balance that Tolkien was trying to make. Yeah, it was the circle he was trying to square. Because I don't think he wanted to be like Huxley and just say, all right, we're going to accept the fact that there's the civilization, the gray world of the machine, where we are kept drugged all the time, and the savage living on the reserve who keeps his humanity and gets to read Shakespeare and whatever else. I think Tolkien didn't quite want to lean into that, but he also wanted to come up with a realistic story as well. He didn't want something, he couldn't go back and be Jane Austen, just telling a story that was nostalgic about the good feelings of the English countryside. He had to do that balancing act.
The second book of the series, in a sense, is the trees become angry enough to destroy the factories, right? And in that sense, there's a very clear kind of reaction. Lord of the Rings is a tremendously reactionary text in that regard. The kind of vision of the sense of the way to recover the Shire is to flood Isengard and basically burn it to the ground, more or less, right? And to cast the Ring of Power into Mount Doom and just melt it all, so that way nobody can have this kind of power anymore.
Well, but can the Shire really be recovered, though?
No, and that's the thing, and that's ultimately where you get the sense of, even though it's that sort of the falling action in that story is, this is the hope that Tolkien comes out, that we can go back after destroying the machine of power of the technological world, that we can come back, and then we can finally run. The wizard? We can run him out of town, and we can reclaim the Shire for ourselves again. We'll have new lords who are from our own people. But yeah.
But again, 100 years earlier, Carlyle was saying the exact same thing as well. He was saying, we've done the Reformed Parliament. What was the first thing they did? They passed the Poor Law, and if you read Chartism by Carlyle, he has some quite funny comments on that. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole right now, but then he says, what was the first thing that the so-called Reformed Parliament did? Was they passed the Poor Laws. And the second thing they did was went right back to doing everything they were doing before the reforms. And that's the sum total of the great reform of the 1830s.
And it does in a sense where I think that one doesn't necessarily throw up one's hands in, that, well, there's nothing that can be done, because but that I think, when you come back to it and you look at some of these authors over, and you realize, as you say, that they're saying the same things for several hundred years about where things are going, what's going to happen, and the ability to stop the downstream negative effects of doing these things. And now here we are, and so there is a sense, I think, that Spengler does actually have it right, and Tainter has it right. Even though he disagreed somewhat with Spengler. that the idea of civilizational cycles does seem to bear out from the evidence. That they're, and when you look over the great civilizations of the world, they do all seem to have a certain similarity to them in terms of, the phases that they go through. And I think there is something to that. And thus you get to somebody like Notes of Underground and Dostoevsky, and it just adds another voice to the mix, saying that you think you're building a crystal palace, you think you're ushering in utopia, and Dostoevsky is saying that you are doing nothing of the kind, and that it'll never happen. And these are the kinds of people that it will produce.
Again, he writes it from the voice of a man with a guilty conscience, and I think he says, everybody who's trying to implement these systems, he thinks that a lot of them don't believe it either. Mind you, again, I've met enough people who work as federal government bureaucrats. It seems like the closer they are to the center of the bell curve, the more of a true believer they are.
Oh yeah,
the whole project. But I still think there's a lot of people who kind of know that the whole system is a bit of nonsense.
There are, I think, far more, if you operate in the middle of the bell curve, that there are far more people in that, like the vast majority of society lives in the middle of that bell curve. And they just believe in the system and its value. And the goal is not to, the goal really is to, how to succeed within the system. And that's basically the vast majority of the kind of advice that you'll be given. And very few people ever kind of confront the sort of work that Dostoevsky does. And when they do, most often they just simply go back to what they were doing before. The memory is very short on this sort of thing, other than for a handful of us who kind of like flogging ourselves like Dostoevsky. At least you can flog yourself, and that'll give yourself a bit of enjoyment.
Well, or, the midwits, even if they believe there's something wrong with the system, they just think you just need to tweak it here, or we need to elect a different leader, or we need to just cut a little bit of the spending here and there, and we'll balance the budget, and we'll go right back to the old vibes. I think that's a lot more common. I think even, I think everybody will roll their eyes and say, yeah, all politicians are corrupt, and the government is desperately in need of reform, but the amount of reform they think that it needs is orders of magnitude bigger than a lot of people are willing to admit or even willing to think about.
So they're just that I think most people just can't conceive of the problem properly, and that's the kind of thing. Anyways, though, Ben, I've got a hard time or commitment that I have to get to, and I unfortunately we could probably talk all day, but I think we've given Notes from Underground its due, and hopefully the audience will enjoy it. And again, speaking of men of the system, we were hoping again to have O'Toole on to add his insights to the conversation, but unfortunately, given that I have a hard deadline, we've run out of time. Again, thank you, Ben, and
my pleasure.
We'll see you next time.